Everybody, and welcome to mini lecture number 2 on therapies. This time we're talking about the humanistic therapy perspective. If you recall our discussion of the humanist perspective on personality, this is going to be very similar to that. So humanistic therapy originates from the same people. Carl Rogers is the big name that we're talking about this time. Humanistic therapy places an emphasis on human potential, self-awareness, and freedom of choice. This perspective really values the conscious and subjective perception of the self as being very important and very central. If you remember from our personality unit, we talked about how important it is for the alignment of the imagined or ideal self and the actual self. And humanistic therapists kind of work to bring those things into an alignment and to promote growth. People are seen as basically good, and they are motivated by the need for psychological growth. So if you remember things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people are generally good, and they're trying to grow towards their psychological best self. A lot of therapy approaches rely on client-centered therapy, and we'll talk about what exactly that means. This person-centered perspective means that a couple of things. Rogers agreed people have natural tendencies to grow and move towards that idea of self-actualization, and there are 3 conditions that facilitate this growth that are tried to be emphasized and maintained during a therapy session. The first is genuineness, both on the part of the therapist and on the client, being honest, direct, and not using facades, so letting those walls down and really doing honest communication back and forth. Acceptance. You likely remember the concept of unconditional positive regard, knowing that you are accepted by others, particularly important people like your loved ones or your therapist, that your feelings, problems are going to be acknowledged and accepted without those people passing judgment. In fact, humanists might think that a lot of problems or psychological issues arise from the presence of conditional positive regard shaping our behavior. The last is empathy, tuning into the feelings of others, showing your efforts to understand and listening well. So humanistic therapists are really big on things like active listening, sort of paying attention, adopting an open and welcoming posture, nodding along, summarizing and repeating back things that the client has said, showing that you're really listening and empathizing with what the client is saying. So other aspects of client-centered or person-centered therapy are that this is non-directive. The therapist does not interpret thoughts, make suggestions, or pass judgment. This is a bit different from some of the more modern Freudian approaches that we've talked about already, where interpretation of the therapist isn't really central here. There's a focus on the client's subjective perception of their self and their environment. Remember, sort of getting their ideal self to line up with their actual self. They typically don't use words like illness or cure in their treatment plans. The therapist is really doing their best to create the conditions that will allow for a client to focus on the therapy and move towards growth. This involves the promotion of genuineness, unconditional positive regard, and empathetic understanding, which we just went into depth to on the previous slide. So another aspect or component is motivational interviewing, in which the therapist will help the client overcome their mixed feelings or reluctance about committing to change. So sort of getting them to really buy into the therapeutic process and invest their energy in positive growth. This is accomplished with things like empathetic understanding and reflective listening, which we have described already, sort of being open, empathetic, and maintaining a real connection. This can help the client explore personal values and motivation for change, so help the client to really buy in and discover their own personal motivations. And this can be applied in a number of different ways. So a humanistic therapist could be a psychotherapist, could be in the presence of marital counseling, parenting, education, business, etc. Oh, and my cat has decided she wanted to come and say hello. Okay. What else have we got here? So comparing psychodynamic and humanistic therapy. So we've talked about the psychodynamic perspective, Freudian perspective. It's a bit different from our humanistic perspective. So psychoanalysis was, of course, founded by Freud and focuses on repressed unconscious conflicts as the source of psychological problems. The main treatment effects that are leaned on there are free association and transference, which we talked about in the last unit. You can go back to there if you need a repressor. refresher. The goals of therapy are to recognize and work through and understand those hidden conflicts, whereas the client-centered therapy of Carl Rogers sees the source of problems as the conditional acceptance that has led a person to distort their self-concept and their worldview, and using non-directive therapy techniques relying on positive regard, unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathetic understanding to try to push the client towards developing self-awareness, self-acceptance, and self-determination. So to help them grow into their best self. Okay, that's it for our discussion of humanistic therapies, and we will see you next time.